Greetings, NCBS family. My name is Kameelah Martin, and I have the privilege of moderating our roundtable panel for today, titled Class Interruptions, Status, Black Women, and Literature. In keeping with the conference theme, Our Sisters Spoke Up, Women, Gender, and Sexuality in Africana Studies, this roundtable discussion promises to center Black women scholars, Black women writers, and Black women's engagement with class inequities. We take the title of our panel from Robin Brooks's new book, Class Interruptions, Inequity and Division in African Diasporic Women's Fiction, which was published this month by University of North Carolina Press. Class Interruptions is an interdisciplinary study of how women writers of African American and Caribbean descent critique issues of class divisions through their fiction. A significant feature of the book is that it facilitates a conversation between the humanities and the social science, as the writers are invested in the same inequality phenomena as social scientists. This literary activism arguably extends the reach of Africana studies, and as such, NCBS is the appropriate forum for the debut of this exciting scholarship. Class Interruptions is receiving noteworthy advanced praise, as Dr. Carol Boyce Davies from Cornell University writes, timely in its recognition of the class positions of essential workers during COVID-19 pandemic, this work shows that writers have engaged class consistently, even as class remained a lacuna in literary critical studies. Robin Brooks confidently contributes this much needed component to advance a new generation of literary scholarship in which class has as much analytical presence as does race or gender. So congratulations to you, Dr. Brooks, on the release of your monogram. I know this is an exciting time for you. And we are all very thrilled that you will engage with us in a sort of author meets critic style roundtable. So our format for this evening is as follows. Following the introduction of our panelists, each will offer a brief commentary of Class Interruptions and pose 2 or 3 questions to Dr. Brooks, which she will answer before moving to the next panelist. So please allow me to introduce our amazing panelists. We will begin with the author. Dr. Robin Brooks is an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Africana Studies. Her research and teaching interests include 20th and 21st century literature, particularly African-American, Caribbean, African and American multi-ethnic literatures, as well as feminist theories and post-colonial studies. She is the author of Class Interruptions, Inequality and Division in African Diasporic Women's Fiction with University of North Carolina Press. Just came out February 1st. And again, congratulations on that. Our next panelist is Dr. Isis Semaj-Hall. She is an assistant professor of Caribbean literature and popular culture in the Department of Literatures in English at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. As the rhythm writer, she podcasts For Prosperity, where she has interviewed Caribbean writers, musicians, visual artists, and inspiring citizens. Her research explores identities at the intersection of dub aesthetics and word power. Dr. Andrea N. is Associate Professor of English and the Director of the Women's Place, a Center for Gender Equity at The Ohio State University. She specializes in African American and 19th century American literature with a focus on class studies, Black women writers, autobiographical studies, and the Black press. She is the author of Dividing Lines, Class Anxiety in Postbellum Black Fiction, published in 2013. She has earned national research fellowships from Rutgers University, the National Humanities Center, and the American Council of Learned Societies, as well as awards for her teaching and her leadership. And lastly, I am Kameelah Martin, currently serving as the Dean of the Graduate School at the College of Charleston, where I am also Professor of African American Studies and English. My scholarly expertise is in African diasporic literatures, mostly of the US and the Caribbean, Black feminist studies, folklore studies, and film studies. I am the author of 2 monographs, Envisioning Black Feminist Voodoo Aesthetics and Conjuring Moments in African American Literature. Thank you so much. So we will jump right in, and I will first invite Dr. Williams to give her comments and pose questions to Dr. Brooks. Thank you, Dr. Williams.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. It's a pleasure again to be here and to be able to celebrate the launch of this book. Class Interruptions, Inequality and Division in African Diasporic Women's Fiction is a welcome addition to the expanding body of research on the representation of class difference in Black cultural production. In the triumvirate of race, gender, and class that has often been highlighted in literary studies to address identity and difference, class has remained the under-articulated factor. By posing intersectional analyses that focus on race, class, and gender together, alongside other factors of educational attainment and locale, Brooks reveals how Black women writers have long been both representing and theorizing the differentiated experiences of Black life. As Brooks describes in her book's introduction, Class Interruptions engages scholarship from fields including public policy, economics, sociology, and history, while still insisting that social scientific methods are not the only means by which we may understand class. Rather, by studying literary and cultural expression, she shows how class is not only a lived reality, but also an imagined or socially constructed concept given meaning through mediated forms such as novels. As she explains, quote, "The methods by which these fiction writers examine class are more critical than scholars have previously recognized," end quote. This assertion is crucial to understanding Black creative artists as intellectuals who are informed by social theory that they then inscribe in their fictional depictions. Brooks builds on a spate of research in cultural and literary class studies in the last decade, and here I appreciate her generous nod to my own book, Dividing Lines, Class Anxiety in Postbellum Black Fiction. There, I argue that the rise and representation of the Black middle class in the late 19th century is portrayed through a series of anxious moments in the dialogue, plot lines, and characterization of Black fiction. I focus on the decades at the turn into the 20th century, around 1880s to 1910, to propose that the post-emancipation era was an especially fraught time for Black thinkers and writers to conceptualize racial solidarity and the elusive promise of upward class mobility and freedom. Class Interruptions raises related questions about the limits of class mobility and racial solidarity for Black people a full century later in the period between 1970s and 2010. But beyond shifting her analysis to a later chronological period than do I, Brooks also expands the scope of her readings to fiction set and published in geographies throughout the African diaspora. In this regard, she underscores not only the situational context of class determinations, but also the ways in which migration and immigration impact Black people's experiences of class mobility. This especially comes across in texts such as Merle Hodges' Crick Crack Monkey, in which characters move between rural and urban spaces, gain class consciousness through the jarring effects of dislocation. As a central thread throughout Class Interruptions, Brooks highlights how what she calls the cross-class relationship trope becomes a literary pattern that novelists use to highlight difference. By focusing on two characters from dissimilar backgrounds, often two friends, classmates, or lovers, writers more often show how difficult class disparity is to remedy, rather than relying on the failed truism that love conquers all. In particular, the novels under study in this book trouble the traditional romantic convention of a woman attaining upward mobility through marriage. Instead, as Brooks shows in her reading, especially of Toni Morrison's novel Love, the romantic trope of cross-class love more likely devolves into storylines of, quote, rape, molestation, and sexual violence, end quote, in which Black women and girls' class status makes them vulnerable to coercion and abuse. Brooks pushes this insight most broadly in the epilogue, in which she explains, quote, rocky romantic relationships unsettle and thereby expose the social hierarchy to reveal the extent to which contemporary society is leaning towards an understanding of reproducing the asymmetry and disempowerment of traditional colonialism and maintaining the legacy of slavery. Again, that is in commodifying Black women's bodies. If the storylines examined within Class Interruptions end with, as Brooks explains, death by avenues such as suicide, murder, drug abuse, or even imprisonment, her readings then point up the seriousness with which Black women writers address class in literary fiction. None of the writers here makes a claim to the naturalist literary tradition, as we know it through the mid-20th century writers such as Ann Petrie and Richard Wright, who present race and class as a social determinant of one's fate. But in that, Brooks's text selection leaves questions for subsequent studies. How do different genres of Black women's writings, such as science fiction, speculative fiction, urban fiction, autobiography, travel narrative, how do these similarly use cross-class tropes or devise other literary devices that highlight class difference or envision equality? As Brooks affirms in her own words in the epilogue, quote, Class Interruptions expands the research on issues of class in general and working classes in particular. It can be an entry point to conversations on these topics and encourage additional studies that seriously engage dismantling inequalities, end quote. And to that I add that this book is indeed a provocative invitation to continue addressing class studies within Black feminist scholarship. Thank you. So to continue our conversation, I'd love to be able to delve into a couple of questions with you. Great.
Okay.
Well, one of the first things that I was thinking about is where I ended in thinking about the power of these different genres and the capacity or utility that they have for representation. I know that your book focuses on fiction, but to what extent do you think that Black women writers might be using similar tropes of cross-class relationships in other forms of writing, particularly drama or autobiography or poetry? And I draw attention to autobiography because I was very moved by your opening gesture to really position yourself in terms of your class background. And we know that that is a move that scholars within class studies and working class studies do in particular. So talk to us a little bit about the particularity of fiction to be able to represent class difference.
Thank you so much, Andrea Williams. I really, really appreciated your perceptions on my book. That was awesome. This feels great to hear other people's perspectives of my writing. So this is the very first roundtable on the book. So I'm excited to hear what people have to say. And yes, indeed, we can start off with autobiography because I want to say that, you know, my personal story shaped my interest in the topic that this book covers, which is class. And so I always tell people that I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. Miami is a large international city. And of course, a lot of times when people think about Miami, they think about the famous beaches, right? Or famous people. And there are a lot of millionaires who live in Miami, but there are also a lot of people who are living in extreme poverty in Miami. And then you have everybody that fit that range in between. And so this is something that really shaped my upbringing as a person. And even though I didn't have the terminology or the language for class differences as a young person, I still recognize these things and observe them. And they did impact me. And I continue to this very day to pay attention to issues of class difference. And so that's how I even came to this book in general. It's just been a long time interest of mine. And so your story, your personal story definitely does impact how you see things. So then talking about a major part of this book, you mentioned it in your talk, is about what I'm calling a cross-class relationship trope, right? And I must say that I absolutely love Andrea's book. I definitely highlight her book within my book as a text that definitely influenced my own research. And so Andrea notes some antecedents of the cross-class relationships that I discuss in my novel from the contemporary perspective. But for this trope, it's simply a pairing. I call it that authors are pairing characters, usually working class characters and middle class characters with one another. And they oftentimes have the same age or the same gender. And so that class background is the biggest thing that separates them, right? And then the authors use this cross-class pair to interrogate a particular theme or topic within the novel. And we see this particular pairing of these two figures throughout the entire narrative. And it allows us as readers insight into the differences between working class living standards and middle class living standards. So I want to start there of highlighting this trope because it goes to the issue of genre, right? So we know that my book, Class Interruptions, is focusing solely on novels. But in my introduction, I do note that this cross-class relationship trope appears in other genres. And of course, issues of class appear in different genres. And so I note that not only does it appear in some other genres, but also by male writers, right? And so I included exact examples of some writers in their books like Ernest Gaines and John Edgar Whiteman. But then talking about genre, I talk about how the short story, I've noticed this pairing within short stories. So for instance, Alice Walker's Everyday Use, I believe that has this particular cross-class relationship trope. And the work of Toni K. Bambara, which I really, really love. I do see this trope in her work too, and particularly within her short story collection entitled Gorilla My Love. And one of the short stories in that particular collection that I really, really love is called The Lesson, right? And so those are examples of some short stories that use this. But in terms of why did I choose the novel as my primary focus in this book is because a lot of the writing in this contemporary period is in the form of the novel. And I wanted to show a change, the shift from the previous period of the Black arts movement and the Caribbean artist movement of the 1960s, where the majority of the writing appeared in drama and as poetry. So I wanted to focus on the novel. And then I wanted to say more about, the inquiry that you have concerning, can we get more from our analysis of fiction or novels versus another form or another genre? And for me, believe it or not, my second book project is on autobiography and memoir, because I wanted to do a shift from fiction to nonfiction. But this may be something that people disagree with. But from my perspective, when I look at or examine autobiography or memoir, I tend to focus on, and what tends to be highlighted for me is what happened. Notice that past tense. What happened in this person's life? Versus when I look at fiction, I feel like fiction forces us as readers to imagine possibilities of what can be. So not only does the literature also highlight the past and some things that have happened, but I feel that it forces us in a different way to imagine possibilities and solutions to some of the issues that are explored in the work. Now, of course, people can say that, hey, some memoirs do this too. Some autobiography some autobiographies do this as well. And certainly you can indeed make that claim. But in terms of, I really wanted to focus on novels during this period of history where we are, because I wanted us to start brainstorming more about ways to address these class gaps. So I hope that answers a lot of what you were posing to me. I think that's a really great question. And of course, the part of the reason why I included that in my intro, and I expand a great deal in my notes in the intro, is because, yes, this is something that people want to know. This is a question that people would be interested in, especially when people go on to do their own research.
I really love the way that you think about how we as readers may bring different reading practices to different genres. And so what you mentioned about, we look at memoirs and autobiography as having more of a kind of documentary approach, whereas where we're looking for maybe an education or for a record or for history, whereas we might be more likely to identify with fictional characters and then alongside them to be able to imagine these alternate realities. So I think that's really provocative to think about that. I was also thinking, for example, about the way that someone like Gwendolyn Brooks uses poetry to write about class difference in Annie Allen or in The Bean Eaters. But there we see her using a kind of omniscient speaker often, which is quite different from either the first person that we get in autobiography or the difference between the possibility of both first and third person in fiction. So really provocative for us to be able to think about what's at stake with the kind of utility of fiction to be able to go across time, across different characters' consciousness, to be able to cross different settings with flashback moments or embedded narratives to really encompass more of a holistic kind of story about what class means both in the past and in the present. So thanks for engaging me with that. As we're thinking too about how novels have a certain kind of utility to be able to tell stories, it happens that certain novelists as well seem to be more invested in these topics than not. I noted that Toni Morrison especially has your attention here, where you address not one, but two of her novels. And it's very true, as I started thinking about the kind of long arc of her career from the very first book with The Bluest Eye, where you're thinking about that scene of, I always recall that scene of the cat dying and Geraldine getting very upset with Bucola, the protagonist, and calling her out of her name. And then a book like Song of Solomon, also too, the main character there, Milkman, is thinking about how to negotiate his own identification with both working class Moors embodied in his best friend guitar, and this kind of middle class privilege that he has through his father and grandfather. So we see Toni Morrison coming back again and again to these topics of intra-racial class difference. So I wanted to know if you've thought a little bit more about the arc of class over Morrison's career, especially because Tar Baby and Love, two of the novels that you look at, are 20 years apart. And we might imagine that the author's own self-knowledge or kind of observations about class evolved in that time. So do you see her using any different kinds of literary devices to talk about class over the arc of her career?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. And you know, when you're deciding what works you're going to focus on, you come up with a whole list, but you can only write so much, right? And so I thought that Morrison's work, my goodness, you know, Toni Morrison is a very recognizable Black writer's name, right? And so when people haven't heard of any other Black literary artists, they've heard of Toni Morrison, right? So I was like, okay, people won't mind if I feature two of her novels. But the reason why I enjoyed her work, why I still enjoy her work, is because she has a long and deep interest and inclusion of class within her body of work. But people tend to focus on race. So how you start off by saying in that triumvirate of race, gender, and class, how class is like the stepdaughter or the stepchild, stepson there, and how people focus on race and gender even within Morrison's work. And I'm like, people, Morrison deeply engages class across multiple novels. The beginning of her writing career as a novelist to the very end. And so that's the biggest reason why I chose Morrison, is because I want people to pay attention to how she is dealing with class in her work. And so something else that's very exciting to me about Morrison's novels is that she uses that cross-class relationship trope that I identified. And not only does she use this trope in multiple novels, like you were able to give some other examples, like beyond Tar Baby and Love, right? You see A Song of Solomon, The Bluest Eye, you see it across multiple novels, but something even more interesting than that is that she has multiple cross-class relationships within the novels.
So, and Paradise, I would say, is the great example of that. Yeah.
Right. And even in the two novels that I focus on, Tar Baby and Love, there are multiple cross-class relationships in those narratives. And I do highlight that. I put a note in that, and I emphasize that within the chapter, that although there are multiple relationships like this is the particular relationship I'm focusing on in my analysis. And so I want to say too that with her work, you know, with my book as a whole, you know, I am identifying what I call the long contemporary period, because I go from the post 60s, so 1970 all the way up to the 2010s. That's a long. And so how we were dealing with and thinking about class issues in 1980 is not the same way that we're dealing with and looking at class issues in 2020, 2022, especially with the pandemic, right? And so I acknowledge that, you know, I don't have any big elephants in the room that are not addressed. I acknowledge that up front in my intro, and I acknowledge it again in my epilogue when I explore Tar Baby's book that was published in 1981 with Kimpadu's novel that was published in the 2000s. That there's a big publication gap. A lot of history has taken place in between that time. So I acknowledge that, and I go into detail about some of those differences there. But something else, another reason why I focus on Morrison twice, as you highlight now, use two novels of hers, I go into grand detail, is because she also explores different types of cross-class relationships. So in the intro to my book, I come up with different types of cross-class relationships. So it could be friends, between friends, it can be between lovers, as you said, it can be between people who are in a certain community space, and it can also be between family Okay, so like if one family member goes on and does something with their life that causes them to be in a higher class or a lower class than their family. So you can have a cross-class relationship even within families. And Morrison explores all of these different types of relationships within her novels. And so I feel like she is just an excellent, excellent example of what I'm trying to say, and addressing a very important part of your inquiry to me is about, okay, well, does she change her approach in the way that she is addressing class there? And one thing that has remained consistent in her body of work is that use of that trope, right? And also her deep engagement with the issues of class. And so the biggest difference between the time periods like in which the novels are published is that the theme, like the major theme or the major topic, the major focus of the novel, that is what shifts. But as far as that engagement with class and even engagement with this trope I'm identified, it's consistent. Can you believe that it's consistent from her earliest novels all the way until her last? So
yeah, and I would say her critique of the middle class is pretty consistent in particular. Her real questioning of their motives and about how they may have internalized those forms of white supremacy or of capitalism or of patriarchy. So I think you're right about saying how she repeatedly comes back to that and thinking that an understanding of class is as central to the story that she wants to tell about American history as is race itself. So great. Thank you so much, Robin, for engaging me.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. That was excellent.
Wonderful. So we got a question from the chat that I think is really timely to some of the points that you all are making. So I'm going to pose this to all of us to respond to. And the question is class no longer an uncool subject in Africana literary studies?
Yeah, so how about, I wonder if that person read my book, because how about the very opening quote from my book, the opening quote from the intro comes from Bell Hooks. And in her book, she says that nowadays it's cool to talk about race and gender. The uncool subject is class. That is my opening quote for the book. And that is linked to what Andrea started off by saying in that triumvirate, how class is less focused on. For me, the title of my book is Important Class Interruptions because it's doing a major goal for the book, which is to interrupt the lack of scholarship on class within different fields. And so my book is contributing to, so answering that person's question directly, that's the purpose of my book. My book is contributing to this discourse on class difference and highlighting why our field of Africana studies needs, why the field needs to be paying more attention to it.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, well, we will transition on to our next panelist, Dr. Isis Semaj-Hall, to give her commentary and pose her questions.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you all for having me at this conference for National Council for Black Studies. I think I'll start with a very simple statement, and it's a statement that we don't want to have to make in the future. Class matters. That's the statement. And class matters for gendered and raced reasons. Through a decidedly cross-class lens, Professor Robin Brooks' Class Interruptions, Inequality and Division in African Diasporic Women's Fiction offers extensive close readings of literary works by some of my most loved and most appreciated authors, such as African-American writers Toni Morrison, Gloria Naylor, and Dawn Turner, and Caribbean writers like Diana Macaulay, Olive Senior, and Merle Hodge. Therefore, Americanist and Caribbeanist literary scholars will benefit from this publication, but so too will African diaspora scholars of various disciplines and interests. In fact, as a hip hop and reggae fan myself, Class Interruptions recalls for me two songs. The first is a song by Jamaican singer Etana. She's a woman who comes from humble beginnings in the poor working class and sometimes volatile community of Augusttown in St. Andrew Parish here in Jamaica. And in this acoustic song titled Wrong Address, Etana sings of having the wrong address and how having a poor home address limits job applicants from being able to ascend the class ladder. I was also stirred to recall Jay-Z's verse on T.I.'s Swagger Like Us, where he notes, "You can pay for school, but you can't buy class." Such a critical lyric. Now, these lyrics from the Marcy-born rapper turned mogul are connected to the themes that Brooks explores in her monograph, particularly in examination of Dexter in Macaulay's Dog Heart. Now, as our world is currently configured, how possible is it for anyone born into poverty or the wrong address, as Etana states, to elevate out of it? Does education return on its promise to raise one from one class to another? Or is Jay-Z right? Can we not buy class? And if not, how do we interrupt class? So in the epilogue of her excellent new study, Brooks explains her use of the phrase "have some class," saying, "Have some class" refers to the need for us to have some more studies of the reverberations of class position in people's lived experiences. The fiction explored in her book, it does just that. Brooks explores how the intersectionality of class and gender, race, ethnicity, and geographical location influences the choices of circumstances of the characters' lives by foregrounding the situations that African American and Caribbean working classes confront, and by centering the increasing class inequality in public discourse. While I am a Caribbean literary and popular culture scholar, I found great value in her readings of novels like Diana Macaulay's Dog Heart, and I was particularly struck by the timely opening and closing to Brooks's work. With a spotlight on the class disparities ripped open by the COVID-19 pandemic, and then closing with what feels like a social justice imperative, Brooks writes, and I quote, "Governments can stop choosing inequality and start choosing to require paid sick leave, to raise the minimum wage so that full-time workers never have to seek food benefits from the government or stand in food bank lines, to impose market rules that prevent predatory behavior from private equity firms, to provide affordable healthcare, and to ensure basic services for everyone." End quote. Brooks's words sound the alarm that now is the time to push our leaders, and where they won't be pushed, we, like our brave writers, must become those leaders. What I'm saying is that Brooks's monograph is a recognition of the power of literature to do activist work and spark change in readers. As she notes, quote, "The writers advocate for a reimagining of societies because imagination is critical during this time," end quote. Brooks looks at how using cross-class relationships as a trope, which is a literary technique that pairs two characters from different class backgrounds, allows readers to imagine solutions to inequalities and class-based abuses. The trope of cross-class relationships exemplifies the importance of coalition building and alliance building that can ultimately lead to the undoing of class divides. Class Interruptions foregrounds the cross-class relationship trope and identifies it as a recurring feature in the literature that operates as a tool for these authors to challenge traditional or dominant narratives on class and comment on contemporary class ideologies. The book investigates the trope and its operation as a lens for examining class in general and specifically how characters representative of working class people function within existing hierarchies in societies. These are Brooks's words, and the task to challenge dominant class narratives is placed at our feet as readers and as scholars. I am deeply moved by this work for sure, but I'm also deeply motivated by it. Now, I have just a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to follow up, if I will, or if I may. Now, Robin, in your introduction, you noted that your immersion in Jamaica better opened up your understanding of class realities in Jamaica. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about how social scientists, ethnographers, social workers, diaspora scholars, writers, and activists, because they are all of these things at once, Zora Neale Hurston of the US and Erna Broadbent of Jamaica, how might they have influenced your scholarship here? And I'm thinking particularly of your year-long residence in Jamaica. I'm wondering if you can say more about the benefits of your lived experience on your READ experience, R-E-A-D.
Very good. Yeah, awesome. So without a doubt, my work is very interdisciplinary because when you're studying the topic of class, you have to address sociology, anthropology, economics. Naturally, you have to if you're going to do a great job in exploring the topic. But I do want to pause first and say that thank you. I am so excited about your take on the book and some of the things that my book made you think of. And how about when I was living in Jamaica, I was introduced to Etana's music, and I really like her song, I Am Not Afraid. And I like the music video that goes along with that song as well. So I like that connection of tying the lyrics to the topic, the overall topic of the book there. But I would say, I wanted to be a scholar. I did not want to be the type of scholar who writes about something, but yet you've never been there. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be a person like that. So I am African American. My ancestors were enslaved in the United States. I have no Caribbean ancestry. And so, of course, even though I was raised in Miami, which has among the largest Caribbean populations in the United States, that still is different from actually living in the nation, right? Or living in different Caribbean nations. And so I took advantage of the opportunity that I had to go live abroad, but not only in Jamaica, I also studied in different places in the Caribbean for shorter periods. So I want to highlight that so that nobody is saying, well, she went to one Caribbean nation, then she can talk about the whole Caribbean nation. No, on the whole Caribbean diaspora. No, that is not what I'm saying. Also, in my book, I focus specifically on Jamaica and the Twin Island, Trinidad and Tobago. And so at any rate, I wanted to borrow fields of sociology and anthropology, and what they do is field work. So I decided that I would conduct literary ethnography. And so ethnography includes things like interviewing people and participant observation. And this is what I literally did. And so while I was living in Jamaica, I went to different places and all across the nation as well. And I participated in different types of activities. I went to different events. I volunteered in different spaces, both in the uptown or middle class areas, as well as the downtown or working class areas. And so I was able to get different perspectives, and I interviewed writers, both published writers and unpublished writers, because I wanted to know their perspectives concerning class issues within their nation as well. And so, I mean, my goodness, it was an eye-opening experience. And now, of course, some things were not new to me, right? Because come on, Miami, what do they call it? Kingston 6 or something like that. There's a lot of, I grew up on Caribbean food, right? So some things were not new to me, but what was the most significant thing, I think, for me in terms of my research is knowing that whenever you are addressing another nation, another region, you need to make sure that you are using that society's ideas and beliefs and systems concerning what class is. So it highlighted for me the importance of doing region-specific and nation-specific research on class. So the way that we identify and explore and even explain class in the United States is not the same way that other nations are exploring and identifying class in their nations. And by me actually living there and doing this participant observation and interviews and just actually living there, I wasn't in a tourist spots, that's a big, big bit of misinformation that people have about Caribbean nations. They tend to think about, oh, let me go get me a pina colada and be out on the beach. But okay, there are people who are actually living in these nations and they're not drinking a pina colada on the beach, right? And so I had a different perspective from a tourist perspective. And it helped me to deepen my analysis of the literature, of the novels, of the narratives. And for instance, I would say, thinking about, I'll use Diana Macaulay's, because Diana Macaulay's first novel, which was published like in 2010, Dog Heart, it actually uses some real life names within the area of Jamaica in which I was living. So it would mention Mona, and Mona being associated with the middle class, and it mentioned like Sovereign Plaza. And I remember I would go to that Sovereign Plaza. And so I was better able to understand her narrative. And I went from seeing her narrative as being something about, oh, this uptown lady trying to help this working class kid out, to seeing that, no, this book really is talking about human rights and violations in working class areas in this fictional representation of Jamaica that she has posed to us as readers. And so my experience of actually living in these spaces really helped me to see things from a different perspective. And the last thing I'll say on this is that another eye-opening thing for me is that a lot of times I notice in many cases that what we would call working class in the United States in some spaces versus what is called working class in some spaces in, say, for instance, Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago, I noticed that the working class people in the United States often had more access to basic necessities than the working class people in some of the Caribbean nations. And so that again re-emphasizes the point how you need to make sure that you are studying a society based upon that society's ideas and scholarship and rules and beliefs concerning whatever topic it is that you're exploring. And I think that's important, as for me being a US citizen, because the United States, we're often critiqued for imposing our ideas and our perspectives and our beliefs onto other people across the world. So yeah, thank you for that.
And thank you for that response. And maybe it's worthwhile noting here in this space that in Jamaica, the minimum wage just recently went up, right? From 7,000 Jamaican dollars per week to 9,000 Jamaican dollars per week. And that was a big deal. Of course, dealing with inflation here, it seems negligible, but it's an important awareness. It's important that I guess we're aware of these bits of change and how they will impact the lives of people on the ground. Of course, that doesn't say anything for the informal sector. But alas, I'm glad you also mentioned Diana Macaulay, because I have a question about her and how she figures into your work. So I'm curious about the creative relationship that you find existing between your selected writers for this text and their fictional characters, right? So that relationship between the writers and the fictional characters. So can you talk about your approach perhaps to Diana Macaulay's work, as she is the only non-Black author that you focus on?
Right. And so I want to say a few things about that. So first, overall, when I approach fiction, I always make sure I distinguish between the life of the author of the work and the lives of the characters in this author's work. So I never assume that the author is talking about herself. And that's one thing, but I will tell you concerning using Macaulay's novel, that was a tough decision, okay? Because I was like, wait a minute, like, do I want to use this? She's a non-Black author, but I do want to say about Diana Macaulay is that She is a native Jamaican. She's a white Jamaican. She's a native Jamaican and has a long family, decades long family history in Jamaica. Okay, so this is a Jamaican. And so her narrative, you know, I had I had criteria for selecting the novels in my book, and her book fit to the T. And so, believe it or not, while I was doing my field work in Jamaica, you know, I would go meet with different people, and I met with some notable Caribbean scholars, and I told them who are Afro-Caribbean. And I told them about this little dilemma I was having. I'm like, well, of course, they already knew Diana McCauley because of her history of being a journalist, right, with a major newspaper there. But I'm like, should I use her book? Like, should I use this novel? Like, I don't. And some rather quote unquote radical scholars actually told me, yes, use it. Go ahead and use it. And I won't say their names, but I know some people would definitely be shocked about some people who told me to go ahead and use it. And it was because of the broader project which you explore in your opening, Isis, of what I'm doing with my book, Class Interruptions. And so if I can use that book as a tool to further show the significance of dealing with class difference and the significance of class on people's lived experiences, then why not? But then something else, how about Diana McCauley agreed to be interviewed by me? And so I went to her Environmental Jamaica Trust office location because she's very much so interested in environmental issues as well. And my God, I absolutely loved her. Okay. I mean, like, wow. I was like, this is like an ideal case study. Like the questions that I posed to her about these class issues. And she was very open about like colorism or shadeism and about being white or being Indian or being just perceived differently, and all of these injustices that take place based upon your racial background and your ethnicity and things like that. And so that interview with her, which is now published in Jamaica Journal, you know, that kind of sealed the deal for me that I would definitely be including her work. And so I'm very strategic with my wording within my book, Class Interruptions. And so I don't say Afro-Caribbean writers, because that's one thing I actually highlight in my book, is that a big difference between the African-American writers and the Caribbean writers I explore is that there's a mixture of ethnic backgrounds. So with the African-American writers, okay, they're all similar to my background as an African-American for the most part. But when it comes to Caribbean societies, you have a lot of mixtures there, right? That you may not see so much of those in the United States. So even with Kimpadu, even though she has some Afro-Caribbean in her, okay, she is not classified solely as Afro-Caribbean. So there was a mixture, and even with Olive Senior, I had the opportunity to interview her as well because she came to Jamaica while I was there. And of course, we know Olive Senior is one of the most well-known Caribbean writers. And she is, some people say, well, Olive Senior is brown because she's a lighter skinned Jamaican person, lighter skinned as in like Barack Obama or Beyonce, but in her mentality, she's very much so Black. And so these learning the different terminology about what brown means versus what Black means and things like that, they were all very significant to my education of Caribbean culture. And so I'm just strategic with my wording. I explore this difference. I highlight the difference. Remember, I don't like to have elephants, right? Unaddressed elephants. So I acknowledge that, and I just say writers from the African diaspora. Jamaica indeed is a part of the African diaspora. So yeah, you picked up on that. That was interesting. That was I had to do a little wrestling with deciding whether or not to include that book. But I mean, I love the book. It works very well for me.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Semaj-Hall, and thank you, Dr. Brooks, for such an engaging response. So I guess I am up next. And I'm gonna play a little bit of a devil's advocate because there was an elephant in the room for me. But we're gonna talk about it. We're gonna talk about it. All right. So Class Interruptions is an incisive intertextual analysis on the ways in which African American and Caribbean women writers in the contemporary period are using literature to undermine and expose the impact of socioeconomic stratification in Black communities. Robin flexes her scholarly dexterity in an interdisciplinary treatment of literature, oral interviews, sociological theory, and womanist conjecture around Black social class identities. She contends with class scholarship on the subject, but also merges present-day theories and paradigms into her analysis. She explores how contemporary Black women writers are taking up the mantle and expanding the use of literature as a type of protest. The elephant in the room for me. In the vein of Richard Wright and Lorraine Hansberry in the interwar years. But you stop short of calling the work of Gloria Naylor, Don Turner, Toni Morrison, or Merle Hodge protest literature. You talk more about their literary activism, and I love that term, the literary activism of these women who dig into the work of class consciousness through the cultural production of themselves and of their characters. I kept thinking about your foundational argument, quote, that contemporary African American and Caribbean women writers advocate for a reassessment of economic, social, and political practices within US and Caribbean societies while leading readers to greater class consciousness, end quote. This arguably aligns to what some might say, what Wright sets out to do in Native Son from 1940. And this brings me to my first question. Right. I was particularly grappling with the introduction as you were kind of setting up your main argument, your foundational argument, and what you argue Black women writers are doing in terms of class. Okay. I kept struggling with, okay, so this is something like what Richard Wright was trying to do. I do think you do it much better. But I was thinking about what you were arguing about Black women writers, what they were doing in terms of what Wright and his cadre argued they were doing and how they were quite vocal about it. Right. So it calls to mind Richard Wright's notion of protest literature and particularly the use of sociology to inform his position about the state of race and the artist's political impetus towards social protest. So is your scholarship in an intergenerational discourse with Wright's protest literature? What are the limitations of Wright's attempt to address class disparities? And how does your intervention diverge from it?
Right. So great question. There's no elephant there. Okay. So I think that you are right. I really love your perspective. And so I had to be strategic, right? So the first thing I want to say, yeah, that definitely, yes, my work is certainly in conversation with Wright and with protest literature. However, if we know anything about protest literature and the debates surrounding it, right? We know that we need to be careful in our choices or decisions to call something protest literature. So what we're getting into is this big debate that was very popular during that time is the art versus propaganda. And we know that some people felt like your cultural production should not be addressing political issues or anything like that, and they would say that it should be art for art's sake, versus people like Richard Wright and even Ann Petrie. They felt like if your art is great, then it indeed is propaganda, right? And so that was a very big and debate that still plays out in different ways today. And so I address this. I include protest literature. I have a note about this. But in an earlier version of my book, I went into further detail, in particular, actually about Richard Wright. And so Richard Wright was by far like the most famous protest writer, right? During this time. And he once was a part of the Communist Party. And then he left that party, and he felt like they didn't do enough to address the working class conditions for African Americans, for Black people. And so in his work, he decided to critique the American left and its ideas. And so he, however, let's be real, we want to, I note in my book that a lot of these protest writers, protest literary writers, did not highlight Black women characters. Okay, and so that's one big thing that Class Interruptions is trying to do, is trying to highlight Black women. So of course, Black people across the world, Black people in general, but Black women in particular as well. And it was, and I even have a quote that says that a lot of the protest writers, like Wright and Ralph Ellison, did not have a great deal of focus on Black woman characters. And so that's one big difference that I'm showing, that these writers who I explore what they're doing, and also something else different that I'm doing. And another big difference too, we have to pay attention to time periods. So similar to what Dr. Williams said earlier on, like this long time period in which we're calling the contemporary period. Well, these publications, this interwar period, you know, we're still within segregation, legal segregation within the United States. So it's a different time period, and they are addressing different battles that Black people are facing. And so, and yes, of course, we're still facing some similar battles, but at least we have laws on the book right now against those things, versus where they did not have laws. We did not have laws in the United States and in the other nations against segregation and things like that. And so that a big difference is that gender piece. You know, there's this lack of attention to gender, also the time period, and then, you know, calling something, you know, I didn't want to put myself in a position of having to say, well, which side are you on, the art or the propaganda? Because to be honest with you, I believe, just as you have stated, I do think that a lot of this work is similar to protest literature. And personally, I don't have a problem with that. But what I do have a quote unquote problem with is I don't want to be categorized as somebody who is, you know, bringing up antiquated ideas and perspectives like that. And so one other thing linked to this idea of protest literature that I had to wrestle with is I had to decide whether or not I was going to call the novels working class writing. So are these novels considered to be working class writing? Because within the field of working class studies, right, that is a thing where you talk about, well, what is working class writing and what is not. And so actually some of the work by Toni Morrison is considered to be working class writing for some scholars within this field of this interdisciplinary field of working class studies. But again, I address it, you know, I noted in there, but I do not go to that point of calling the writing working class writing. I say that, you know, some people call it that, and it definitely does have overlaps with the definitions that are given for the working class writing and the definitions that are given for protest literature. But I don't think that it takes away from my overall argument in the book. But I don't think that me choosing not to classify this work as protest literature, or choosing not to classify the work as working class writing, I don't think that it takes away from my overall argument that I'm trying to make in the book, is that these writers are trying to address issues of inequalities and come up with ways for people to think more deeply about them. But believe it or not, yeah, I have the same mind frame as you concerning, I feel like the literature, yeah, it definitely could be called protest literature in some ways.
It strikes me too that we've often thought about protest literature as being directed towards an implicitly white audience. And the text that you're addressing and your interest in intraracial class stratification among Black Americans, I think suggests that there is a Black audience, particularly for Morrison's novels, but perhaps a dual audience in thinking that protesting white supremacy alone or protesting issues of racial capitalism alone might be too narrow for the kinds of conversations that you're having here. So I think that that's really valid kind of inquiry to think about how can we be taking on and drawing from, even as I gestured earlier, recognizing the way that kind of mid-century naturalism did allow for Black writers to use some voice to talk about class, and how that was still too limited maybe to talk to Black target audiences and to be able to address gender in the poignant ways that these more contemporary writers do.
Yeah. And I think, you know, for me, what was really exciting about your work was to think about it as this extension of this idea of protest literature. You know, we have seemingly gotten away from that and kind of couched that into that particular time period. And it was useful then, but we've moved on, right? But really kind of looking at kind of this arc of Richard Wright and Anne Petrie, and then kind of looking at what you have done with, as you say, that long contemporary period, and really engaging this work, I think, in a more nuanced way. I really love the ethnographic part that you brought to the piece, right? And all of these ways that really, you know, perhaps Wright didn't have that particular access the way that you do and scholars of Black literature do now, but really kind of thinking about this idea of protest as evolving. And that's really where I saw your work is really extending that particular idea and bringing it into this very contemporary moment. And that made me excited, because I have a love-hate relationship with Richard Wright. Like, he gets the respect, but he also gets on my nerves. And so, you know, I struggle with him. But I think that, again, he is an important figure, and what he brought to the table is important. But how can we trouble that? How can we extend that? How can we, you know, worry the line, if you will, on what he was doing with protest literature and make it more inclusive, particularly when it comes to gender? So I was really excited to kind of make that connection, and I think your work does it beautifully. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there to see if other people were also thinking about it in that way.
Yeah.
All right. So to my next point, so you discuss Jamaica, and I'm just checking the clock here. All right. So you discuss, excuse me, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the US. But we know you are a scholar of other works, particularly across the diaspora. And class disparities aren't just happening in those spaces. And we've all kind of tossed out some other authors and works whose work might engage with your scholarly disposition. I think about particularly Adichie's Americana, Rena Brodbeer's Louisiana, Michelle Cliff. And so as I was kind of reading through this work, and I kind of cringed, because I was like, I know there were so many other things that she wanted to include and think through as she was kind of putting this together. And so I am just wondering, out of curiosity, what other works or authors did you consider writing about that did not make it into the manuscript? What are some of the other locales or texts? And you mentioned in your response to ISIS, you talked about you had a particular criteria for which books you would include. I'd love to hear about that too. So what other locales or texts also take up this issue of class interruptions, elevated particularly by Black women?
Right. And so in terms of the general criteria, I go into detail about it within the intro, but of course, remember, I wanted to focus on women writers. And a big reason why is because I wanted to know what, if any, intervention were women writers within these fields making concerning what we often call the feminization of poverty, which means that women make up the majority of the disenfranchised across the world. So that was the first thing. I knew that I wanted to focus on women writers within these spaces. And then I wanted to focus on novels. I explained earlier about why I chose the novel form. And then I wanted to focus on novels that had this particular trope that I saw, right? And so the novel had to have a great deal of the plot focusing on class issues and then also focusing on the quote. So I came up with a list, and it had to be published within this contemporary period that I outlined. Those are examples of some of the things that I wrote down. Yes, you are right. And how about you even name some of the other scholars? So there were authors and novels that could not make it into a book. So, you know, we have to be realistic about publishing. You know, publishing is a business, right? And the more pages, the more costly the book is, and things like that. And so how about I wanted to focus on some other novels, and what I did was I just wrote an article on those instead. So I have an article on Adichie's Americana. And so Chimamanda Adichie's Americana, as well as No Violet Bulawayo's narrative, We Need New Names, that particular novel, I wrote an article that's published now on how African writers use certain stereotypical ideas about African people, so people from different nations in Africa, how they turn stereotypes on their heads, how these creative literary artists, how they turn stereotypes about African people on their heads within their fiction. And so I wrote an entire article about that. And so, yeah, that's not a part of the book, but in my other scholarship, I do include different locales, as you're saying, and of course, different texts. But one text that I must say that I really, really grappled with, and I actually did include it in the book, but you know, once you get through editing and things like that, reviewers or whatever, they were like, no, you have to cut this one. And it was Paul Marshall's novel, The Fisher King. So this is one of her later novels that she published. It's called The Fisher King, and she definitely has cross-class relationships throughout that novel. And not only that, we know Paul Marshall is embraced by both African-American and Caribbean communities because she was born in the United States to Barbadian parents, right? And so this particular novel, The Fisher King, the setting, the different locations, so it's across the African diaspora. So she focuses on Black communities in France, like particularly Paris, as well as in New York City, right? And so I was like, yeah, this is perfect. You know, it has the whole diaspora thing as well as the class thing. And I included it, and originally I had included it as my epilogue, and solely as my epilogue, like nothing else, and like those other works, Morrison and Kimpadu, not a part of that. But some reviewers, before I even got to my publishing stage, so when the first version of this, before it was ever a book manuscript, they felt like, no, just publish that differently. And so how about, yeah, it's going to be a book chapter that's coming out soon with Cambridge University Press. It's focusing on new writers across the African diaspora. And I centralize Paul Marshall's, The Fisher King, and show how these newer writers are basically building upon a lot of the ideas that she expressed there. So, people can check out my whole research scholarly agenda to learn about, other texts and other locations across the diaspora. But in terms of having to make some tough decisions with the book class interruptions, yeah, some things just could not make it in. So, and I'm content I'm content with the book as it is, with some of those things not in.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left. I would like to invite any of our audience members to drop questions or responses, or look, no, here they are, to come off mute and perhaps ask some questions of the author or the panelists and engage in a little more discussion before we wrap up. So the floor is open. Anyone want to, and I certainly have some follow-up questions, but I want to give other people a chance to engage with the author as they would like.
One other thing that I wanted to add before we open it up to everybody is about audience. I wanted to talk about my intended or ideal audience for the book, you know, and or what is something I want everybody who reads the book to leave with. And, you know, for me, I want anybody, no matter what your field is, as Isis said in her opening, no matter what field you're in, I want anybody interested in eliminating inequalities and learning more about inequalities to read my book, you know. And I want people to really recognize the significance of paying more attention to the role of class and people's lived experiences. And also, importantly, I want people to stop blaming, particularly working class people, for their circumstances, when many of these circumstances really stem from structural inequalities. So oftentimes in our societies, people say, well, you're like that solely because of the decisions that you have made. Well, this really ignores attention to the broader issues that are shaping our lives in our societies. And thank you for sharing that, Isis, about the recent move in Jamaica concerning the minimum wage, of them moving from 7K to 9K. Well, what if there's a person who is, they're working hard, you know, they have a full-time job and it's minimum wage, but clearly this society sees that that amount of minimum wage was not enough for these people to have all of their basic needs met. So that was out of these people's control, you know, concerning like what the minimum wage is. And that's something that I say about the United States as well, that governments, you know, we're making decisions via our policies and our laws, that these decisions we are making are negatively impacting a lot of people. And I literally end my book with that common phrase that people all over here now, that 99 versus the 1%. I want people to start really humanizing the 99%, and let's start exploring more deeply these experiences of people who are not considered to be well off in their society. So I have a hope for my book that even though, you know, it's literary analysis and definitely it is interdisciplinary, I'm hoping that, you know, people from different disciplines, different fields engage the work. And I have been fortunate enough to get some comments from like some engineers and people like, I'm like, oh, computer scientists and things like that. I'm like, okay, this is great. This is what I want the book to do. I want it to be attractive to a wide array of people.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I wasn't sure if there was someone in the chat. I just have to pull it up. Okay, so I had a question that I had thought about before, and I'm wondering, I guess, if maybe not just Robin can answer, but anyone can answer and think through this with me. So writers have long been inspiring changes on local, national, and at times even on global scales, right? And we can name them, right? But more recently, we have been paying attention to the writer as activists with more and more fiction writers, right? Traditionally fiction writers who have been turning their narrative talents to nonfiction outlets in order to raise awareness of human rights violations, gender inequality, and political oppression. So I'm wondering what you, Robin, and what you all might think is precipitating, right? Writers to do this, right? And for Robin, what do you suppose is pushing the writers that you spotlight in your class interruptions? What do you think is pushing them to center on class using the cross-class trope?
Well, I don't think I will address the broader topic. And I think what comes to my mind based upon what you have said is public humanities, right? I think that a lot of literary artists are aware now that if they want their work to be highlighted, if they want to be known, if they want to get out the issues that they are exploring to a broader audience, they must then bring it to the public. And so you see this a lot with a lot of people, as you have explained here, doing public speaking all around different venues, and people may have never read their work, but they know them via a talk that this person gave, or being on a panel. This person was a part of a panel. And I think that that is showing like the changing of times. You know, we must adapt, right, to our changing societies. And we are definitely in full-blown technology mode, right? Where you can put up a little TikTok video with a key slogan from your book, or make an awesome tweet as a quote that's a part of it, things like that. So I think it's a great thing, right? We're expanding access to the ideas that we think are significant. And I think that's important, that rather than us, particularly those of us in the ivory tower, so to speak, so rather than us just talking to one another, why are we not talking to broader audiences? So even with my work with this book, I wrote a couple of op-eds that deal with some of the topics, this overall topic of class difference and class change. I wrote some op-eds on that too. And so even for people who may have never come across my book, right, Class Interruptions, they may have read that article that I wrote. And so I personally am trying to do what you have just explained. I am trying to reach broader audiences, because I think that this issue is very important. And not only is it very important, we're all connected to it, whether you're aware of it or not. Class is impacting your life, no matter where you are in this world. And so that is something that I'm trying to do as a literary, as a cultural scholar. So even though I'm not a creative writer, I still am trying to engage broader audiences to get these issues out. I don't know if somebody else wanted to add on to that.
I think I was trying to, tick through a couple of the authors and thinking about how many of them do write across both fiction and nonfiction. And I think that's why the work of the late Cheryl Wall was really important in turning our attention to, for example, the essay form, and getting for us to think about how even we understand someone like Toni Morrison, not solely for her fiction alone, but for things like Playing in the Dark and other ways that she begins to theorize on American history. So in those ways, I think that certainly the kind of what people are sometimes calling the language of racial reckoning over the last 2 years has heightened the profile of some Black creative writers and content producers. But I do think that there is a tradition of Black writers writing across a number of different genres.
Right. I think that's very important. That actually makes me think of something that Isis posed in one of her questions. She specifically named Zora Neale Hurston and Erna Broadbeer. And both of them wrote essays as well as fiction and nonfiction, right? And they operated across different fields as well. And I actually use some of the essays from some of the writers in my book. I use some of what they wrote in their essays to help support some of my claims about their creative writing there. So yeah, definitely, I agree with that. The significance of the other, once again, going back to genres of what Andrea opened with in her opening question there.
All right, I'll do a last call for comments or questions for this panel. Yes, Mr. President of NCBS.
Just thanking you all so much for a wonderful generative session that has contributed to this conference immensely. I won't take long because I'm going to prepare for some of our closing ceremonies, but that is essentially it, just thanking you. You know, on the propaganda versus art, there's often an assumption that, oh, you know, must involve an agenda, and art isn't supposed to have an agenda, so to speak. And in either case of that divide, the dividing line, there's an assumptive logic that can miss a lot of other things. You know, to simply be inclusive in your literary analysis, to be inclusive in your creative writing as an artist, the possibilities of what that opens up, that act of inclusion in the story you're telling, in the way you're telling it, it opens to so many possibilities that can be an artistic agenda in and of itself, without anything else being brought to bear or protesting any other kinds of structural dynamics or anything. It's just to create that space of inclusion in your art, in your narrative, in your analysis, opens so many immense possibilities and can be so generative in the way this session has been. Thank you, and thank you again.
Thank
I would
you
just-
for joining us.
I would just like to say how wonderful that panel was and how on point it was and educational for me, because as I've studied literature, I've not given a whole lot of thought to class and literature. So thank you so very much for that perspective.
Thank you all. I'm glad that people found some good use in the work, and I hope that people continue to find great use in it. And I just want to thank my fellow panelists one more time. You all will forever be my first roundtable ever for my first book. So I really appreciate it. I appreciate your insights and your perspectives. Excellent job. Kudos to all three of you. So we can wrap up here, Kameelah.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations again to you, Robin, on the publication of such an amazing piece of work. I am sure that this is just the beginning of all the scholarly dialogue and even extra scholarly, right? Because you are very particular about it not just existing in an academic space. It's a wonderful piece of work. It was my pleasure to be a part of your first roundtable. And so we wish you the best as you continue to promote and engage the world with your book, Class Interruptions. Thank you all for your engagement. Have a wonderful rest of the evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.